So this one's a little bit different to my normal Brexit ramblings. Has the EU had enough of Theresa May? My opinion, and bear in mind this is just my opinion, yes they have. The fact that Angela Merkel didn't meet Theresa May and didn't even have anyone waiting for Theresa May, she got out the car, speaks volumes. I can't really say I blame them. Theresa May is not a charismatic person. Even when she's reading from the script, it's just painful. She's not even that good at improvisation because she tends to go back to what feels like a scripted response, something that she has rehearsed over and over again. She doesn't do well with people interactions. And that's the biggest failing when it comes to EU negotiations. Now, of course, in the beginning, and somewhat consistently, the EU said, look, everything is up for negotiations, but you must sort out the Irish border first. We're not even going to think about everything else until the most important issue is completely resolved. Well, of course, Theresa May's own party rails against her at every turn because, again, she's not that good with people. And the EU are in this very odd place. See, much like an adult doesn't want to see a screaming child in pain, the EU don't want to see the citizens of this country get fucked over. But they're in a position where if they try to do anything that would stop that, well, that's the EU taking over. How fucking dare they? But of course, if they don't, well, we've lost 77 trade deals. In fact, we've lost more than 77 trade deals. Every single Brexit promise gets exposed as a lie, and it's an unbelievable whack to the head that we can't recover from. This isn't just something that will affect elderly generations. This will go for people who haven't even been born yet, because once we're out, we can't just suddenly grovel back and say, oh look, we really fucked up, can we please come back? Because after all of this mess, there are still people who believe all of the Brexit lies. There are still people who believe we pay 350 billion a week, when even when that number first came out, it was disproven. There are people who think WTO is much better than what it actually is because Jacob Rees-Mogg keeps coming out and saying it, despite the fact that WTO officials come out and said, no, that's not right. There are still people who think everyone is lining up to trade with us, despite the fact that maybe we've got a trade deal with Thailand. The Boycott Israel campaign is taking quite a big foothold. So Israel is desperate to reach out to anyone who will actually trade with them. And America have been very clear. In order for us to trade with them, we have to scrap a huge proportion of our workers' rights at the very least, scrap our food standards and privatise our NHS so that we have an American health system where getting cancer means you don't just have to worry about, living. You also have to worry about going completely bankrupt if, of course, you're fortunate enough to have money as it is. But again, if the EU does anything to kind of mitigate this damage, well, they're seen as what they're seen right now. Donald Tusk is trying to convince other members of the EU to give us a year extension rather than the piss poor 30th of June, which is nowhere near long enough. And already he's getting criticised and torn down for it. Now, I'm no fan of Donald Tusk, but if someone's trying to do the right thing and they're getting politically slaughtered for it, if I was in that position, I would have to wash my hands and say, okay, you're on your own, son. I did my best. Now face up to the liars and see how many promises come true. Whereas Remainers like myself, or Ramonas, who kept getting slapped down as spreading Project Fear, The things that we warned about and worried about are slowly coming to fruition. We have lost a ton of companies who aren't coming back to this country, and we've not even properly left the EU yet. Our NHS is in dire straits because they can't guarantee getting in the medicines. In fact, there was a story a little while ago, I didn't get around to covering it, where doctors have been told by the NHS if they can avoid giving long-term prescriptions, that's what they should be doing because they can't guarantee the medication. People with epilepsy are in a world of trouble right now because there's not a guarantee we can get the right kind of medication. Now imagine someone driving a car who normally, because they're on the right kind of medication, is not an issue. But imagine if they slip into a seizure. Imagine if they're on the motorway. Imagine if they're passing a children's school and they slip into a seizure because the NHS could not get the drugs that they need into this country in time for them to actually need it. So, is the EU pissed off with Theresa May? I think they are. And to be honest, I've heard a few people saying it's disgraceful how they've insulted our Prime Minister that way. Insult her all you want. Since Theresa May took over, something like 400 food banks have cropped up. Not because it's just some random occurrence, but because the necessity of having them is so dire. Homelessness shot through the roof. Cuts to the police and fire services over and over again, despite the fact that these experts, boots on the ground, are saying if you do this, it's going to cause a shit ton of trouble. And of course, a shit ton of trouble comes, and Theresa May stands by her guns. Oh no, I mean, I cut funding to the police 100 times and crime has gone up, but I don't see the correlation. Want to insult Theresa May, you go for it. There are legitimate criticisms to have of the EU, but I have very, very rarely actually heard any of them when it comes to Brexiteers demanding, promoting, or sticking by their guns of why we should leave the EU. And again, if I was an EU official, quite frankly, I'd be fucking sick of it. Now, I'm a man who has to have patience because of my job. But even then, my patience would have exhausted by this point. And I have to say again, it's not a guarantee that we're going to get that year's extension that we so desperately need, because in almost 3 years we have done next to fuck all of what we actually need to get done to be prepared to leave the EU. Yet we have spent a shit ton of money on companies who are now just sat on their ass doing absolutely nothing. Again, taxpayers' money being well spent thanks to Chris Grayling. Honestly, Theresa May is in a tough spot, but she's in a spot that she put herself into. When she took office, there was nothing that mandated her to trigger Article 50. And as I had an argument with a friend yesterday, a lively debate, when we ticked that box to stay or to leave, there wasn't a date of saying we would leave by such and such. No preparations have been put in place, or next to no preparations have been put in place. That 80% of that income that we are going to lose has not been propped up somewhere else. And yet EU officials are still sat around thinking, Jesus, they could still just revoke Article 50.